They're studying you again, but not with microscopes, therapists, private investigators, or phony friends sliding into your DMs. This time they sent the professionals, the ones who don't flinch when bombs detonate, the ones trained to remain unnervingly calm while the world around them burns. And when those hardened warriors analyzed how you responded to betrayal, they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. That absence terrified them more than any weapon ever could. When they sabotaged your life, pulled every string to watch you collapse, and orchestrated your downfall with surgical precision, they expected noise, screaming, revenge plots, the very instability they had painted you as. They expected you to become reactive to match the caricature they'd spent so long creating. Instead, you did something that shattered their entire model of human behavior. You answered with silence. Not the silence of surrender or shock, but the silence of someone who had already calculated every outcome and decided their games weren't worth a single raised heartbeat. That still, unmoved quiet is what has analysts rewiring their training manuals. The military even studies footage of how you behaved, how you refused to flinch when they destroyed your reputation, how you kept your center when they turned people against you, how you preserved a calm that looked almost supernatural while your life was being methodically dismantled. They try to replicate it, to bottle that absence of reaction that made your enemies question their own existence. What they don't, and will never understand, is that this wasn't created in a classroom. You didn't rehearse this under controlled conditions with safety teams on standby. You forged it in the field, in real time, where every betrayal was live ammunition, every sabotage and actual explosion, and every assault on your character was a genuine attempt to assassinate your soul. Those were not drills, those were defining moments. Out of that fire, you developed something no military academy can teach, the capacity to become absolutely unreachable. That unreachability is not a skill learned from doctrine or drills. It is the product of surviving true danger without losing yourself. It is the quiet power of someone who refuses to feed the story their enemies want to write, and in doing so becomes their greatest confusion and their deepest fear. When someone attacks you, they aren't merely trying to wound, they're trying to control. They want a reaction because your reaction is their victory. Your tears become trophies, your anger their validation, your breakdown their masterpiece. But you, that rare and unsettling anomaly, offered them nothing. No flinch, no tremor, not even a hitch in your breath. You became a void where their assaults went to die. That absence of response is the moment they stopped seeing you as a person and began confronting something far beyond emotional manipulation. The special operations instructors even coined a term for it, tactical non-existence. It describes a state of such complete non-reactivity that you effectively cease to exist as a viable target. Enemies can't strike what won't respond. They can't break what refuses to acknowledge the idea of breaking. They can't win against something that doesn't recognize defeat. You didn't merely ignore their blows, you rendered them irrelevant, turning sabotage into background noise, betrayal into white static, carefully plotted destruction into weather you barely noticed while your attention was on something far greater. What you were focused on was evolution. While they celebrated what they thought was your ruin, you were quietly constructing the new version of yourself, foundations they couldn't perceive, growth they couldn't interrupt. Their victory laps looked petty beside the architecture you were building. You ignored them not from weakness, but because you were too busy becoming unstoppable to indulge their small games. Now the case study is shown to elite classrooms, and every instructor pauses the film at the moment any ordinary person would have snapped. The twitch, the clenched jaw, the betrayed posture. But you nothing, absolute zero. A mountain indifferent to a mosquito, an ocean that swallows a match, the universe unmoved by a tantrum. How do you reach that level of non-reaction? The veterans, the commanders who've seen everything, simply shake their heads. They know the truth. This isn't a technique to learn, it's something you become. This is what happens when pain stops being painful, not because it disappeared, but because you felt it so often it became familiar. This is what happens when betrayal loses its shock value because you've already catalogued every possible variation. It's what occurs when someone transcends the basic programming of human emotional response and rewires the rules entirely. You didn't merely grow thicker skin, you built a different nervous system, one that no longer flags sabotage as a threat because you've reclassified those blows as harsh education, one that no longer registers betrayal as pure pain because you've recoded it into usable data, one that no longer interprets attacks as invitations to crumble, but as clumsy, frantic attempts by inferior systems to stay relevant. Rather than layering armor over vulnerability, you removed the very framework that made being wounded possible. You became emotionally bulletproof by changing the definitions themselves. Their analysts mapped this into a 3-tier system inside the Zero Response Protocol. Level 1 is conscious suppression, the effortful holding back of an obvious reaction. Level 2 is conditioned non-response, a trained reflex born in controlled environments. But Level 3, the level you reached without manuals or simulators, is something different. Non-reaction is default. It's not a choice you make in the moment, it's a characteristic you embody. Stability doesn't need maintaining because it simply is. Tried to reverse engineer that third level for months and failed, because you forged it under live fire, where every hit was real and every consequence irreversible. What breaks them even more is what came after. They expected delayed collapse, a meltdown when the mind finally processed the damage, fractures that would appear once the noise stopped. They waited for the delayed reaction that never arrived. Instead of cracking, you moved through it. Instead of breaking down, you broke through. Where others show scars, you show growth. Where most people develop triggers, you develop immunity. Where wounds produce weakness, your wounds produced weapons. They've labeled it in their classified files as the inverse trauma response, and all it proved was that their models of human failure didn't apply to you. Every act of sabotage against you didn't reduce your power, it multiplied it. Every betrayal didn't shatter your capacity to trust, it shattered the limits that once contained you. Every attack didn't erode a foundation, because you had already become the foundation, unshakable, self-generating, and impossible to topple. Special ops psychologists are obsessed with your neural signatures. They've compared brain scans of people under assault, mapped fear circuits, tracked anger spikes, charted trauma markers, and your pattern refuses to match any of it. While others show activation in defensive hotspots, your brain lights up in regions tied to problem-solving, pattern recognition, and strategic planning. When the present chaos arrives, you're already 3 moves ahead, constructing possibilities from ruins they haven't even imagined. That's why elite units make your case mandatory study, not because you're conventionally violent, but because you embody a new kind of psychological warfare, non-participation, as strategy. The tactic of absolute non-reaction is itself a form of retaliation. You don't strike back because striking back would validate the fight. You don't erect defenses because defending concedes the possibility of being conquered. Instead, your silence, your stillness, becomes the most disorienting countermeasure. And here's what truly unnerves them: when they pour energy into destroying you and you refuse to receive it, that energy doesn't rebound, it implodes. Their attacks collapse inward, wasting the force they invested, dissolving into nothing. Your presence converts their weapons into emptiness, and that failure, the way their effort eats itself alive, is the quietest, most devastating victory of all. They end up destroying themselves with the very weapons they aimed at you. Their poison finds no host and circulates back through their own system. Their fire has no fuel and ends up consuming the one who lit it. The military names this phenomenon a psychological ricochet, but you call it justice, not the kind you chase or enforce, but the natural kind that arises when someone attacks what cannot be attacked. When someone tries to drown what breathes underwater or burn what was forged in flame, there is no need for plotted revenge. Your non-reaction becomes revenge in its purest form. Every second you remained unmoved forced them to question their power. Every day you stayed calm eroded more of their control. Now they're witnessing the long-term consequences. The ones who sabotaged you are unraveling, not because you struck back, but because you refuse to play their game. They are haunted by your silence. They check on you obsessively, searching for damage and finding only growth. They invent stories about your supposed private suffering, then watch you thrive in public. They scripted your downfall and keep seeing your rise. A rise that has nothing to do with them. That is the exact outcome. Special forces trainers try to recreate the ability to render enemies irrelevant through absolute non-acknowledgement. They want the power to dissolve attacks simply by refusing to validate them, the skill of being so committed to your own evolution that sabotage cannot find the bandwidth to take hold. But they keep running into a wall because they are trying to teach a technique while what you embodied was something far deeper. You didn't learn to not react. You evolved beyond being affected. Instructors bring in experts, trauma psychologists, neuroscientists, who map stress circuits, even philosophers fluent in transcendence, and they all leave shaking their heads. This shouldn't be possible according to their models. The human nervous system is wired to react. Millions of years of evolution, priming us for fight or flight, yet somehow you've overridden that program. In their files, they've labeled you Subject Zero, not because you were literally first, but because you achieved absolute zero response, zero emotional deviation, zero psychological impact, zero acknowledgement of attack. You've become the measuring stick they hold against everyone else, the baseline their experts whisper about in classified rooms. But here's the paradox. Every candidate they line up to compare against you fails, and not because they're weak. They fail because they're still trying to reach zero, by chiseling pieces away, by subtracting emotion, by suppressing their natural instincts until they resemble statues instead of people. They grit their teeth, clench their jaws, and force stillness through tension. But what you did was nothing like subtraction. You didn't hack away at yourself. You didn't suffocate your reactions. You transformed into something entirely different, something that simply does not generate the responses they are trying so hard to smother. And that transformation unsettles them on a level deeper than science. If you had turned to ice, if you had grown numb and detached, they could have charted it, classified it, and nodded in understanding. That fits their models. But you didn't become numb. You became selectively alive. You still laugh at beauty. You still cry with love. You still gasp at sunsets and feel moved by music. You haven't lost your emotional palette. You've expanded it, refined it. What you discarded wasn't feeling. It was wasted energy on the wrong kind of feeling. You no longer respond to attacks, betrayals or manipulations because your nervous system now identifies those as background noise, not threats. You didn't amputate your emotions, you recalibrated them. It's as if you built a psychological immune system. Most people catch betrayal like a virus. They flare with fever, collapse with pain, and take years to heal from the infection. But you developed immunity. What used to wound now educates. What used to trigger now informs. Every attempt to sabotage you gets filtered, processed and neutralized before it reaches your core. You still experience the full range of human depth, joy, passion, love, grief, awe, but treachery no longer makes the list. Betrayal lost its passport into your body. That immunity is what makes you so disorienting to your observers. They can't chart it, can't simulate it, can't reverse engineer it, and so they build elaborate exercises trying to duplicate your responses. Special ops recruits sit in staged scenarios where betrayal is scripted, where sabotage is orchestrated by colleagues, where reputations are mocked and attacked under controlled conditions. They want to see if their soldiers can reach the state you embody, but every trial ends the same way. The subjects still believe in the game. They respond to wins and losses, to praise and shame, to attack and defense. They operate inside a framework you long ago discarded. You didn't just play better, you realized the game was the cage, and you stepped outside of it. You saw that victory and defeat, attack and defense, win and loss, all of it was an illusion, designed to keep people looping in reaction cycles. By refusing to acknowledge the board, you shattered the entire match. That's why their simulations collapse. They're trying to train people to act calm in the storm, but you became the atmosphere itself. You're not just calm in chaos. You are the calm that makes chaos irrelevant. And this is why your psychological profile has been locked away in classified vaults. Not because you're dangerous in the conventional sense, but because you represent a new species of consciousness. If the world at large grasped what you've embodied, the entire scaffolding of power would tremble. Imagine millions of people suddenly refusing to acknowledge manipulation. Imagine whole populations no longer feeding fear campaigns, no longer validating propaganda, no longer wasting energy reacting to engineered sabotage. The entire machinery of control, which depends on predictable responses, would grind to a halt. Fear requires reaction. Manipulation requires acknowledgement. Without those, the system starves. And yet, the irony is they can't stop studying you. They're addicted to the mystery because, in their world, in a world of psychological operations, international conflicts, manufactured narratives, the ultimate weapon is not a missile or a gun. It's what you've achieved. The ability to remain utterly unmoved, not because you've trained longer, or because you're tougher, or because you've been programmed by some cutting-edge technology. You reached this through lived experience, through fire they didn't think you'd survive, through betrayals they thought would shatter you. What they engineered to break you became the very conditions that rewrote you, and that is why their efforts always fall short. You didn't practice this in simulations. You forged it in the unrepeatable crucible of your own story, where consequences were permanent, where every betrayal was a live round, where every loss was real blood and real cost. You didn't learn how to suppress reactions. You evolved past needing to react at all, and because it was forged in real pressure, your evolution cannot be mass-produced. It can't be bottled or taught in classrooms. It can't be reduced to a checklist of tactics. That's the secret that keeps them awake at night. You didn't reach zero by subtraction. You became the kind of being who no longer generates the responses they expect in the first place. You didn't become unreachable by shutting down. You became unreachable by transcending. And that makes you more than an outlier in their models. It makes you the proof that a new kind of human consciousness is possible, and the reminder that the old ways of power are already crumbling. The reconnaissance teams that monitor you now work with a different directive than the ones who first watched for weakness. They aren't there to figure out how to break you. They've accepted that's impossible. Their mission is shifted. They want to understand how you broke the system that was built to predict and exploit human reaction. They study how you stepped outside the basic mechanics of social exchange, how you removed yourself from the bait and response loop that most of humanity lives inside. They screen hours of footage not of you in combat or rage, but of you simply moving through ordinary days while storms spin around you, quiet breakfasts while the rumor mills roar, calm phone calls while entire narratives are being constructed to dismantle you, composed walks while allies are being turned into accusers. It's not the content of your actions that stuns them, it's the cumulative silence of what you refuse to offer. That absence is so total it reads like a presence, a gravitational stillness that rewrites the meaning of influence in any room it occupies. They have tried to codify what they see into doctrine. Slide decks titled Tactical Void, Operation Zero, and manuals labeled non-acknowledgement protocol circulate inside locked networks. Trainings are staged in expansive compounds with role players and simulated betrayals. Recruits are taught breathing patterns, scripted pauses, and micro-behavioral techniques designed to mimic your calm. But every simulation produces the same failure. The trainees still believe the scene is real. They act as if a response will validate an attack, as if silence is only a pause before the real reaction. What you embody is not a pause, it's a complete shift in orientation. You didn't learn to shut down a reflex. You rewired the map so that the reflex no longer exists in the first place. The difference between mimicry and becoming is the difference between a stage, prop, and an entire ecosystem. They bring in the best neuroscientists who map circuits, trauma psychologists who read rupture patterns, social engineers who deconstruct influence algorithms, even cultural anthropologists who study narrative economies. The scans are perplexing. Where their models predict spikes in panic or defensive arousal, your brain shows activity in planning, pattern recognition, and long-view construction. While others are occupied by the immediate threat, you are reallocating the energy toward building, laying blueprints for futures they can't imagine burning down. The experts publish papers, host confidential briefings, and argue about policy implications, but their charts can only outline correlates. No imaging will reveal the million tiny decisions that reshaped your responses, the unglamorous repetition of saying no to validation and yes to self-authority until the default switched. Because the transformation you underwent wasn't a single event, they cannot isolate a single cause. They comb through your past looking for the catalytic moment, the betrayal that tipped the scale, the one scandal that did it. They fail. What remade you was not a spike but an accumulation, the slow arithmetic of micro-deaths and micro-rebirths. Each time you refused to feed someone's script, a small part of you died to the need for external approval. Each time you redirected anger into strategy, a new habit formed. Over months and years, these tiny forfeitures added up until the old reflex pathways were effectively pruned. It reads in their reports as an emergent architecture: less reactivity, more construction, less validation seeking, more internal governance. It was forged in necessity, not pedagogy, in nights when the stakes were real and the cost of failure carried a different gravity than any training exercise could simulate. And the implications stretch beyond personal case studies into structural risk. If your condition is not a one-off, but an evolvable mode of human functioning, then a whole industry of control built on eliciting responses becomes brittle. Propaganda depends on predictable receivers. Psychological operations depend on reflexive outrage. Reputational warfare depends on people who will play the script. You rewired predictability out of your system, and that undermines the leverage others rely on. That's why their interest in you is not only clinical but strategic. They imagine a world where more people refuse the bait, where emotional manipulation fails at scale, and the architectures that profit from reaction lose their foundation. The thought terrifies systems that were engineered for leverage. Still, as they scribble notes and lock away files, you live, you keep your rituals, you allow joy, love, and beauty to enter unimpeded. You haven't traded humanity for stone. That selective responsiveness, full-spectrum living minus the reflex to be baited, is the thing they cannot replicate. They can map its edges, name its phenomena, even stage exercises that approximate the outward appearance of your stillness, but nothing in their labs will recreate the slow, necessary alchemy you endured. Becoming what you are required more than technique. It required real consequences, irreversible losses, and the daily resolve to choose your own internal logic over the narratives others wanted to impose. So they will keep watching. They will keep trying to reduce you to diagrams and training modules because in their world, understanding is power. But watching you live, to build while others attempt to burn, to create while the old machines of sabotage were uselessly engaged, is the hardest lesson they face. Some evolutions cannot be taught. They must be inhabited. The military wants to reproduce you to field soldiers who cannot be broken, operators who cannot be manipulated, assets who cannot be compromised. They pour resources into programs, draft doctrines, design simulations, and yet what they keep generating are imitations, hollow facsimiles of what you are. From those labs and training grounds, they churn out mission specialists taught to suppress, to hold still, to mimic emptiness. But mimicry is not embodiment. They manufacture resistance when what the world actually needs is transcendence. Resistance braces against impact. Transcendence redefines the plane on which impact can land. You are not merely resistant to sabotage, you are immune to it. You are not simply strong in the face of attack, you are invisible to it. You do not mount defenses against betrayal, because you exist in a dimension where betrayal is irrelevant, like arguing about the shade of gravity. That irrelevance is not a technique you practiced. It's a state you arrived at, through a process of becoming. That's why every top-down intervention fails. They attempt to distill your presence into a checklist, breathing exercises, mental frameworks, stoic scripts, contingency drills, and then expect soldiers to perform the same results in the artificial safety of a compound. What they forget is that your stillness was not born in a rehearsal room. It was forged in the unpredictability of life, under pressure, shaped by consequence and repetition, until reaction simply ceased to be the default. You did not learn to suppress a reflex. You rewired your baseline, so the reflex no longer exists to be suppressed. Training can teach how to hold silence. It cannot teach how to become the silence that makes the provocation meaningless. Psychological warfare divisions have named the phenomenon they cannot yet manufacture asymmetric response theory. Their papers argue that the most devastating countermeasure to a coordinated assault may be strategic non-engagement, the deliberate omission of validation, the refusal to acknowledge the premise of the attack. In their models, silence becomes a weapon, because it deprives the aggressor of feedback, and therefore of meaning. But their framing still treats it as a tactic, as a cognitive choice applied in the moment. They miss the distinction that makes your effect catastrophic for their playbooks. For you, zero response is not tactical, it is ontological. It's not something you put on like armor for a mission and remove afterward. It's the shape of your inner world. The ripples your zero response created are not purely tactical, they are cultural and neurological, where they predicted fragmentation and delayed collapse. They observed a reverse trajectory, attackers checking themselves, allies recalibrating, entire networks beginning to doubt their own assumptions. Psychologists, in closed briefings, now write about reflection, a creeping corrosive self-interrogation in those who invested energy into your destruction. They see former perpetrators replaying their actions at night, seeing the pointlessness of the cycles they fueled. The energy that was intended to dismantle you turns inward and becomes a mirror that reveals their own smallness. Even more unnerving for them are the systemic possibilities. If your state can spread, if more people could refuse the bait, ignore the staged outrage, decline to validate engineered scandals, then whole industries of influence would lose their leverage. Propaganda, reputational attacks, manufactured moral panics. All of these depend on predictable receivers who will feed the machine. You rewired predictability out of your system, and in doing so created a new vulnerability in the architecture of control. That is why think tanks and annexed research units obsess over your file, not purely as an experiment, but as a strategic threat. Yet all their data and scenario planning cannot duplicate the private alchemy that made you indigestible. Biology will show correlates different neural activations, altered stress markers, reallocated attention from limbic reactivity to prefrontal construction. But nothing in a scan can reproduce the incremental moral choices, the ritual refusals of validation, the small daily deaths to the need for external applause that cumulatively altered your operating system. You did not become unreachable by following a curriculum. You became unreachable because you were forced to compose yourself differently again and again, until the old circuitry atrophied and something else took its place. So they will keep trying, drafting new modules and renaming programs, hoping to convert your phenomenon into doctrine. But every iteration tends toward the same failure. The trainees can act like you for a series of minutes or hours, but when real consequence arrives, where and when a betrayal is not simulated but existential, the theater collapses, the manufactured void snaps because it is always tethered to the belief that the scene is real. Your condition is untethered. Its reality is internal and unshared, which is why it cannot be taught as a performance. You became the ground itself, rather than a player on someone else's set. In the end, their attempts to copy you teach them something else entirely. Some capacities can't be mass-produced because they are not techniques. They are ethical dispositions, habits of attention, forms of inner governance cultivated under pressure. You evolved into a state where sabotage cannot reach you because you no longer give it permission to exist inside your experience. That truth unsettles institutions built on control, but it comforts the rest of us. Proof that transformation is possible, that the most effective defense is not more armor, but a different kind of being. They are destroying themselves with the very actions they aimed at you because those actions have nowhere to land. Every calculated shove, every engineered rumor, every coordinated campaign of sabotage hits a void, and when energy hits nothing, it turns inward. The people who poured their power into your undoing find themselves contorting to make sense of your indifference. They grow frantic, trying to manufacture a reaction, any reaction, because your non-response erodes the narrative that gave their behavior meaning. Without your validation, their attacks become theater without an audience, and that absence forces them to stare at the choreography of their own smallness until it becomes unbearable. Special ops analysts watch this unraveling with a mix of clinical interest and baffled alarm. In closed briefings, they've named the phenomenon psychological void warfare, the capacity to neutralize an adversary, not by force, but by refusal, by simply not recognizing them as an enemy. That's all for today. Dear Father, I pray for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is lacking. Let me believe in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. I believe, Lord, that your thoughts toward me are filled with peace, prosperity, and hope for a bright future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always hearing my prayers. I lift this prayer to you in the mighty name of Jesus. Thank you, Jesus, for your unfailing love and faithful provision. I am deeply grateful for your presence in my life and for the abundance and joy you continue to pour out on me. If this message touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Tell us in the comments about your journey of faith and how you're preparing for your own triumphant breakthrough. If you'd like to support our ministry, consider blessing us through Buy Me a Coffee. Every contribution, whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share, helps us create more inspiring content and spread God's word to those who need it most. The link is in the description below. Don't stop here. Watch our next video for more encouragement and hope.